So we've obviously been looking at the Hasmonean kingdom, the uprising, the period of independence, and we've got our way through to the beginning of the Roman Empire. This next half an hour or so is just going to be having a look at Roman rule and how they operated their rule over Israel, and actually in large parts of the empire functioning in the same way and with local rulers, but from Rome overall. And so just a little bit, I mentioned before, it was a really turbulent time in Roman history when just at the time when Israel was assumed into the Roman Empire, was the time when the empire was turning from a republic into the empire, into the dictatorship. In 63 BC, the Romans occupied. In 44 BC, Julius Caesar is killed. In 40 BC, the rebellion and the triumvirate and all the stuff that happened, there are three Roman generals, Julius Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, who first of all had this sort of unofficial truce between each other to try and overthrow the Senate, and then later that broke down and Julius Caesar becomes the first, if you like, dictator, except they were so afraid of that they stabbed him in the back. So then his son Octavian becomes the ruler in Rome. So you see this change from Rome being ruled by the Senate, now it's ruled by a dictator. It's changed from being a republic, now it's an empire. Julius Caesar is murdered. His adopted son Octavian becomes ruler, later being given the title Augustus Caesar. Again, a name we recognize from the New Testament. So the empire is divided into regions. This is how the Romans rule. They have all these different regions, and they put their own rulers in place in those places, and they are either called a legate or a governor. There are different systems that they rule in different places. Sometimes they put in their own man from Rome, put him in. Other times they take a local ruler and he rules underneath the Roman Empire. That is what happens at the beginning in Israel. The local ruler, first Antipater and then his son Herod the Great, rules in actually more than Israel. Herod the Great kingdom was fairly significant. He's got Israel, and he's also got the area to the north and to the east, which is his as well. And he's got this large area, which is later divided into three at his death. So when we read in the Bible, some of the rulers are ruling over the area once it's been broken up. But that's Herod the Great's area of ruling. The Idumeans, as I mentioned, were Edomites. They'd been forced to convert to Judaism by the Maccabees. And Antipater first, and then Herod is ruling there. So as I said before, the Jews sort of grudgingly accept Herod as ruler because it's better than being directly ruled by the Romans. It's better to have somebody, though not a Jew, they are converted to Judaism. So they're allowing Jewish religion and worship, in fact encouraging Jewish religion and worship to happen. And of course, Herod is famed for his building. He builds lots of buildings, one of which is, obviously this is not a photograph, this is somebody's drawing from the historical records. He builds a temple in Jerusalem. This is what the temple would have looked like at the time of Jesus. Herod's temple is famed. There's one bit left of it now, really. It's the Wailing Wall, it's the foundations that are left. But his temple was said to be incredible. There are obviously lots of descriptions. And as a result of that, somebody's drawn a picture. So hopefully that helps us a bit. he builds the temple. He builds, again, this is an artist's impression from Josephus's writings. This is the Antonia fortress. Yes, so this, in a sense, was a first, an architectural first, because it is a fortress and it is a palace. It's the first time that we know that to have happened. Previously, there were fortresses and there are palaces, but Herod puts the two together in Jerusalem, right next to the temple, just almost across the way. If you went into the west gate of Jerusalem, the fortress is on the left and the temple is on the right. That feeds into some of the things that we see in the New Testament. In fact, when Jesus comes on his triumphal entry into Jerusalem, it's said that many expect him to turn left to go towards the fortress to overthrow the Romans, and in fact he comes and he turns right and he overturns the tables in the temple, because he's actually trying to overthrow the corruption in the Jewish nation. Anyway, that's another story for another day. So we've got the Antonia fortress. At the time of Jesus, it's the Roman garrison for the soldiers. And when Paul is arrested in the temple in Acts 21, the Roman soldiers come running from the fortress. This is the fortress of Antonia. And it's probably here that Jesus is mocked and beaten by the Romans before his crucifixion. Herod also built many other things. There's a list of some of them. Herod's palace in Jerusalem, the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, Roman public facilities and baths and theatres and amphitheatres and hippodromes. He renovated the Pool of Siloam. He built a channel for water into Jerusalem. He built a road for pilgrims. He built a complex at a different town, Lower Herodium, named it after himself, which was basically palaces and gardens and beautiful, basically for his own benefit. He built a tomb for himself. He built the fortress at Masada. Some of you will have heard and known about the stories of Masada, 70 AD or thereafter. The Jewish rebels were holed up there and starved themselves to death, but Herod built that place earlier on. He built Caesarea Maritima with its palace and its harbour. So basically built a palace and a town on the Mediterranean coast for trade and all of that stuff to go on. He built some palaces at Jericho. He built 3 temples dedicated to Augustus, who was obviously the emperor at the time. So he is known for, first of all, ruling a large area. He's known for allowing the Jews and encouraging the Jews to worship God, Jehovah. He also built loads of stuff in the Roman way and incredible buildings, a couple of which we've seen artists' impression of. Herod died, it's believed, in 4 BC. Therefore, Jesus was not born in 0 BC because he was born before Herod died. So Jesus was born before 4 BC, probably 6 BC. Somebody got the dates wrong somewhere in their calculations. So that's another story. So he was succeeded by 3 different rulers. Herod Philip, who's one of his sons, Herod Antipas, another of his sons, and then Archelaus, a third of his sons. And you can see his area is divided into 3. You can see really Herod Philip is ruling what is not Israel. That is sort of the north to the east. That's not really what we deal with. Herod Antipas he's ruling in Galilee, and he's also ruling in the east part of the east of the Jordan. This part here, known in the New Testament often as Decapolis, the 10 towns. The place is basically east of the Jordan, and often when the Jews are traveling from Jerusalem, which is somewhere here, to Jericho. They won't go through Samaria, which is here. They go across the river, up there and back across. So that is, when you hear of the people traveling down to Jericho, they're going to cross in that way. So these are the successors of Herod. Some were more successful in succeeding him, if that works as an English sentence, than others. Herod Antipas, he governs in Galilee and Perea. Herod Philip governs in Iturea and Trachonitis. And Herod Archelaus governs in Samaria, Judea, and Idumea. However, you'll see the length of their reign is very different. 4 BC to 39 for the first two. The third one, Herod Archelaus, only 4 BC to 6 AD. He was not able to keep order in his area. The Jewish people are known to the Romans to be rebellious people, and he cannot keep control. And so instead of having the local ruler, instead of having one of the Herods ruling, so we'd call all of these Herods, basically the Romans out with the Herod, in with a Roman procurator. They're sending someone from Rome to rule in Judea and Samaria. We know the name of one of those very well, Pontius Pilate. He is the fifth, I think, of the procurators. Maybe it's in the notes somewhere. And then during this period of time, Tiberius succeeds Augustus as Roman emperor. So just a little bit on Philip, the Tetrarch. He governs in Iturea and Trachonitis. This is the area north and east up there of the Sea of Galilee, which he ruled as Tetrarch in the former northeast quarter of Herod the Great's kingdom. It's modern northern Israel, Lebanon, southern Syria. Herod Philip marries Salome, the daughter of Herodias. This was the girl who got her mother, who her mother used to entice Herod Antipas to execute John the Baptist. So Philip is married to Salome. There's another story there which we'll get to in a little bit. In his domain, there are very few Jewish people. It's not part of Israel. Consequently, Philip pursued a policy of Hellenization, following Greek culture, really going into Greek stuff. He built up a city called Caesarea Philippi, named obviously in honor of himself, Philip, but also in terms of Caesar. So he's named it after Caesar and himself, Caesarea Philippi, and it became a center of Greek culture in the area. Worship of the god Pan was centered there, and there was a cave where worship took place, which was known as the gates of Hades, because it was believed if you went into that cave you could access the underworld. This really feeds into something incredible, because in Matthew 16 it says this: when Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, some say Elijah, others say Jeremiah, one of the prophets." He asked them, "Who do you say I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, Son of the living God." Jesus replied, "You are blessed, Simon, son of John, because my Father in heaven has revealed this to you. You did not learn this from any human being. Now I say to you that you are Peter," which means rock, "and upon this rock I will build my church, and all the powers of hell," the gates of Hades in Greek, "will not conquer it." It's very easy to imagine that as Jesus is teaching them, they're probably standing within sight of this Greek. They've come out of Israel. They've come out of a Hebrew cultural context. They've gone into a Greek cultural context. And Jesus said, "Who do people say I am?" They're out of their comfort zone. They're out of their own people. They're away from home. And Jesus is asking these questions. And then he's pointing at even the gates of Hades, even the Greek gods will not prevail against my church. And we read here the Greek word ecclesia to describe the church. Jesus could have used Hebrew words, Hebrew concepts, didn't. He could have used the word for synagogue. He could have used the word for temple, but he didn't. He used the words ecclesia to show what the church should be like. He's using a Greek cultural model to describe what his church will be, which is really interesting. Ecclesia in Greek really means an assembly of people. So I want to just show here that Jesus is quite deliberate. He takes his disciples out of the Hebrew context and culture, takes them to a Greek town and says, my church is going to be based on a Greek model of assembly. That's very challenging for them and probably for us. So it means the assembled ones, they're summoned or called out from their respective involvements by a herald for a specific purpose. So gatherings of people are assembled at the request of an authority and therefore a special group. So the church, the ecclesia, has the following distinctive in the New Testament. It's called out. They're called out of the world. They're called by God. They're called for a purpose and relationship with God. They're called together to be called a body together, and they're called to fulfill the Lord's purpose on earth. It's really interesting because we struggle with that. Even though we're Greek thinking, we struggle to make the church a group of people in our culture. So many people think of church as a building, and we are in a building that people would describe as the church. But of course the church is the people, and Jesus takes his disciples out of Hebrew culture to point this out to them. And this has been one of the things that has been attacked repeatedly throughout history. In fact, if you go back to 500 years ago when King James said, translate the Bible to English to his people, he gave them a bunch of instructions on how to translate the Bible. And the one which is really, really damaging and has damaged the church ever since is, the second one he said is, you must not translate the word ecclesia as assembly. You must only translate it as the word church. And it was all about him retaining his power. And that word, ever since in our English translations, we've struggled to see it translated as assembly. The meaning in English is not what it should be in terms of Greek. And I've just picked that out as these are examples of some of the things that we misunderstand because of culture. So we move on. Oh, no, I haven't got any more pictures. So when Tiberius the emperor died in AD 37, Caligula became the emperor in Rome, and he installed his friend King Agrippa, Herod Agrippa, as ruler in Judah, Samaria, and Idumea. So if we look back at the couple of pages, Herod the Great's family tree, you'll see Agrippa is his grandson. But he's grown up in the Roman court with Caligula. They are childhood buddies. And so when Caligula becomes emperor, he says to his friend, right, you go and rule in Judea, Samaria, that area there. And then that year, Agrippa accused his uncle Antipas, who's ruling the area immediately north, accused him of treason. So Caligula takes away Antipas's area, gives it to Agrippa. And so Agrippa is expanding the kingdom, and eventually he also gets, can't remember, however, by 39 AD, Agrippa is ruling over all of the same territory that Herod the Great has been ruling over. So Agrippa has got a similar power. This is obviously just at the end of the time of Jesus, beginning of the time of the early church. Agrippa is ruling in that area. Agrippa is liked by the Jews, but persecuted the early Christians. So we see in the New Testament, the Jewish people, in a sense, are accepting of this Herod Agrippa, but for the church, it's not so good. Acts chapter 12 says this: it's about that time that King Herod, that's Herod Agrippa, arrested some who belonged to the church, intending to persecute them. He had James, the brother of John, put to death with a sword. When he saw that this pleased the Jews, he proceeded to seize Peter also. This happened during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. After arresting him, he put him in prison, handing him over to be guarded by 4 squads of soldiers. Herod intended to bring him out for public trial after the Passover. Now we know that resulted in a miraculous release. An angel came and brought Peter out of prison. But you can see there that Herod is starting to persecute the church. Herod Agrippa, basically, the power went to his head. He's friends with the emperor. He thinks everything is going my way. And he began to consider himself as God. In Acts 12, verse 23, it tells us how he died. Herod went from Judea to Caesarea and stayed there for a while. He'd been quarreling with the people of Tyre and Sidon, which is further north on the coast. They now joined together and sought an audience with him, having secured the support of Blastus, a trusted personal servant of the king. They asked for peace because they depended on the king's country for their food supply. On the appointed day, Herod, wearing his royal robe, sat on the throne and delivered a public address to the people. They shouted, "This is the voice of God, not of a man." Immediately, because Herod did not give praise to God, an angel of the Lord struck him down, and he was eaten by worms and died. That's quite a short account of Herod's death. If you read Josephus' account of Herod's death, it gets more gory than that. Do I have time to read you? That's the question. Oh yes, I'll do it. Now when Agrippa had reigned 3 years, this is Josephus' history. When Agrippa had reigned 3 years over all Judea, he came to the city Caesarea. There he exhibited shows in honor of the emperor. On the second day of the festival, Herod put a garment made wholly of silver and a truly wonderful contexture, and came to the theatre early in the morning, at which time the silver of his garment was illuminated by the fresh reflection of the sun's rays upon it. It shone out after a surprising manner and was so resplendent as to spread horror over all that looked intently upon him. At that moment his flatterers cried out that he was a god, and they added, "Be thou merciful to us, for although we have hitherto reverenced thee only as a man, yet shall we henceforth own thee as superior to mortal nature." Upon this the king did neither rebuke them nor reject their impious flattery, but as he presently afterward looked up, he saw an owl sitting on a certain rope over his head, and immediately understood this bird was a messenger of ill tidings, as it had once been a messenger of good tidings to him, and he fell into the deepest sorrow. A severe pain arose in his belly and began in a most violent manner. Therefore he looked upon his friends and said, "I whom you call God am commanded presently to depart this life, while providence thus reproves the lying words you are now saying to me. And I who was why you called immortal am immediately to be hurried away by death, but I am bound to accept of what providence allots, as it pleases God, for we have by no means lived ill, but in a splendid and happy manner." After this, his pain was become violent. Accordingly, he was carried into the palace, and the rumor went abroad that he would certainly die in a little time. But the multitude presently sat in sackcloth with their wives and children after the law of their country, and besought God for the king's recovery. All places were also full of mourning and lamentation. Now the king rested in a high chamber, and as he saw them below lying prostrate on the ground, he could not himself forbear weeping. And when he had been quite worn out by the pain in his belly for 5 days, he departed thus life, being 54th year of his age and the 7th year of his reign. and that's Flavius Josephus' Antiquities, if you're interested, chapter 19, verse 343 to 350. There we go. So Herod died this death of sudden acute pain. 5 days later, died in his palace. So Agrippa's successors, Agrippa II, his son was given Iturea and Trachonitis, the northern part, but the rest of the province was given to Roman procurators, Antonius Felix, 52 to 59 AD, Porcius Festus, 59 to 61 AD. Festus calls on King Agrippa the second, who was a Jewish expert in the law, at the trial of Paul. If you remember, Paul is on trial, and Agrippa is in Jerusalem as well, and they call him in and they talk. You can read all about that in Acts chapter 25. So these are the guys who are ruling the Roman areas, and in this case, these are appointed from Rome. These procurators are appointed from Rome in a similar way that Pontius Pilate had been just a few years before. So just a little bit on living under Roman rule. Next week we're going to look at a lot more detail of the people groups. But what did it mean for the Jews? So who were the Jewish leaders and how were they able to lead? We get some sort of picture at Jesus' crucifixion. You know, the Sanhedrin, the Jewish council, has to come to Pontius Pilate and ask permission. So they're not able to, impose the death penalty or those sorts of things without getting permission from the Romans. But they do have a council, they do have a leadership, and so they are allowed to govern their social and religious affairs, but not really the political during this period. The Sanhedrin Council is the key part of that. Richard, you told me a Greek word which I didn't know last week. What was that? So the Romans allowed the Greek word is boulion, local rulers, local councils to rule underneath their political rulers. And the Sanhedrin is one of the examples of this, but it was happening all over the empire. So the Jewish expression of this is the Sanhedrin Council. It's a group of 71 men who meet every day except for the holy days, so except for Sabbaths, except for the religious holidays. Sometimes it's referred to in the New Testament as the chief priests and the elders. And the high priest was the president of this group. And yet they're 70 and they are voting, in a sense, in a Greek way on decisions. Their appointment is pretty much political. It's done by families or whoever you are. But they make their decisions by democracy in some way or another. So this is made up of three groups of people. You've got the chief priests. The chief priests are largely Sadducees, so they're largely people that sympathize with the Romans. They're largely people that want to see Greek culture established, and they're largely political people. They've gained their position from the Romans, and so it's in their interests to keep the Romans happy. You see this at the crucifixion of Jesus, when basically the high priest is saying it's better for one man to die than for the whole nation to fall, in a sense. And so that is their position. The high priest, by the time of Jesus, the role of the high priest was more of a political than a religious appointment. And they lived at a much, much higher level than the ordinary people. Archaeologists have described the chief priests, the chief priest's house, as a mansion. It's a Roman villa. And when you understand, you see pictures. That's what the level of the standard the high priest is living at that time. And they paid for this by imposing a temple tax on everyone. If you read Matthew 17, I think that's the passage where they say, does Jesus pay the temple tax? And Peter says, yes, he does. And then he goes and gets a coin from the fish's mouth to pay the temple tax. And that's paying for the life of luxury of the priests, as it were. The second group in the Sanhedrin Council is the scribes. No, the elders, sorry. The elders are made up of laymen. So they're not priests, but they're from the aristocratic families. They're the important families in Judah, particularly in Jerusalem. For the most part, they own a lot of land, and that's where they've gained their position. They're the backbone of the Sadducees. So they are Greek-thinking, Greek-speaking, Greek-sympathizing people. The third group that made up the Sanhedrin are the scribes, and these scribes are the experts in Jewish law. So they've gained their expertise because they copy the law. Basically, their job is copying the law. Therefore, they learn it. And so they're the experts in the law. When you read in the New Testament, it says the scribes, or in the more modern translation, it says the experts in the law. It's talking about these people who copied the law. They were almost the lawyers of the day. If you had a law question, you went to see them. And they provide the teaching that's a religious and moral backbone for the Jewish people during the time of Jesus. Probably Nicodemus is one of these. He's described as the teacher of Jerusalem, probably the most senior of those. They're often addressed as teacher, and because they knew the law so well, they're trusted as lawyers. And this group is largely Pharisees. So you've got Sadducees and Pharisees making up the Sanhedrin Council. Sanhedrin was the highest court in the land, and the decision was binding on the Jews in Palestine and the Jews that are dispersed. So the many thousands living in Alexandria, in Egypt, for example, are still bound by the law set by the Sanhedrin Council in Jerusalem. During the time of Herod, the jurisdiction of the Sanhedrin is really curtailed, though it continues. So previously, they've had a much greater, in the Hasmonean kingdom, they've had a much greater influence. Now they're really restricted to social and religious laws and have to ask permission of the Romans before they, like at Jesus' time, before they can impose the death penalty on all of those things. They usually met in the temple, but sometimes the house of the high priest, which is what we see again the night of Jesus' crucifixion. They meet in the high priest's house. Peter is found in the courtyard around the fire. So all of that we can see in Scripture as we have done. Right, that is it for tonight. Goodness me, that's good timing, isn't it? Next week. I don't know why 71. I think it's to do with the fact that it's an odd... No, I don't know. Who knows? There's probably some reason, but I don't know what it is. Maybe I'll have a look and see. Next week we're going to really look and break down the people groups at the time of Jesus. So, for example, the Hellenists, the Hasidim, you'll have heard of the Hasidim, the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Herodians, the Essenes, all of these you see in the New Testament, perhaps with the exception of the Essenes. The Samaritans, who are they and where did they appear from? That's really quite important. And the Zealots, so that will be the first session next week. And then we're going to start to look at some of the New Testament letters. Next week we'll start to look at Corinthians. So it'll be a bit of a change of pace, a totally different culture than what's going on in Israel. Thank you for coming. Sarah said to me, you should pray at the end. And I said, I'll get you to pray. She's just gone. Great. Father, we want to thank you that we can study your word, that we can understand your people and you better as a result. Father, I pray you'd help us to really be able to not only understand it, but to put into practice what we're learning as we read your word, as we study what you're saying to us. Father, we pray you'd continue to speak to us through your word. in the name of Jesus. Amen. Good. Thank you very much.